With all of that being said, this cannot continue. There will be either peace or there will be tragedy for Iran far greater than we have witnessed over the last 8 days.
And the United Nations has warned against yet another cycle of destruction following the U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. At the UN Security Council emergency meeting, UN Secretary-General António Guterres once again called for de-escalation.
We must act immediately and decisively to halt the fighting and return to serious, sustained negotiations on the Iran nuclear program.
The Iranian envoy to the United Nations, Amir Said Iravani, condemned the United States and Israel's acts of aggression on Iran. He also dismissed the offer of diplomacy on nuclear talks as a quote, as I'm quoting here, policy to mislead the international community.
Timing, nature, and the scale of Iran's proportionate response will be decided by its armed forces. Throughout history, the resilient and united Iranian nation has withstood deeper wounded and faced more vicious enemies, and this time too. It will show its dignity, strength, and greatness to the world.
Israel's envoy to the UN, Danny Danon, said that U.S. and Israel do not deserve any condemnation, but appreciation and gratitude for making the world a safer place.
To those who now fake concern and cry escalation, we say, this is what the last line of defense looks like, when every other line has failed. Make no mistake, the cost of inaction would have been catastrophic. A nuclear Iran would have been a death sentence just as much for you as it would have been for us.
Well, meanwhile, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Dorothy Shea strongly defended the U.S. strikes on Iran at UNSC meeting.
Last evening, U.S. military strikes targeted nuclear facilities in Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, with the aim of dismantling Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and stopping the nuclear threat posed by the world's foremost state sponsor of terror. This operation sought to eliminate a long-standing but rapidly escalating source of global insecurity.
Now, amid all this, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog, Rafael Grossi, urged Israel and Iran to cease hostilities to allow for inspectors to carry out their work in Iran.
We have a window of opportunity to return to dialogue and diplomacy. If that window closes, violence and destruction could reach unthinkable levels, and the global non-proliferation regime, as we know it, could crumble and fall.
It was not immediately clear when the Council could vote on the draft resolution. Russia, China, and Pakistan have asked Council members to share their comments by Monday evening. A resolution needs at least 9 votes in favor and no vetoes by the U.S., France, Britain, Russia, or China to pass. And to discuss more, we are now being joined live by Rafael Cohen from Washington, D.C. He is a senior political scientist at RAND. Thank you so much for joining on the broadcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's begin with the latest strikes that Israel has been carrying out on Iranian military targets, including missile launch and storage sites. Now, Israel does look adamant to continue the strikes, and Netanyahu has said Israel's strikes in Iran will not end prematurely. At this point, what could possibly be the other targets for Israel now?
Yeah, well, I think Israel set off with really two primary military objectives in this campaign. The first being the nuclear capacity, and you've seen that being targeted fairly regularly with the strikes on Natanz, Isfahan, well, the American strike on Fordow, as well as some smaller sites as well. But the other primary concern for Israel has been Iran's growing missile capability. And we've seen even conventional missile capability having a profound effect when it targets Israeli infrastructure. And so from the Israeli standpoint, they want to neutralize that. So they want to go after both launchers, but also missile production facilities, missile storage sites and the like. And then the third objective here, and this is sort of tangent to the other two, is in order to do both targeting of the nuclear facilities, but also the missile sites, you also have to take out the Iranian air defenses. And so you've seen that be a sort of primary center point of Israeli targeting over the last week and a half or so.
Right, and just recently, a few moments ago, President Donald Trump has hinted at need for regime change in Iran. He's accused the current establishment of not making Iran great again. Do you think that could be another target that Trump has always also been talking about in his address just the day before, when he said that there are lots of targets left?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think President Trump means what he says, in the sense that when he gave the speech to the American people, he basically laid out a choice for Iran. Either you accept negotiations over your nuclear program now and take an off-ramp, or if you choose to retaliate and double down, the United States will escalate in turn. And I think the fairly blatant threat here with calling for regime change in Iran, I think that's part of the either you take the diplomatic off-ramp or something worse is going to happen, and that means going after leadership targets and trying to topple the Iranian regime.
Right. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had called on China to encourage Iran not to shut down the Strait of Hormuz after Washington carried out these strikes. Do you think Iran is now capable of doing so?
It's capable of doing so, at least in the military context. The Strait of Hormuz is quite narrow. Iran has plenty of fast speedboats, missiles that could go after sort of the slow lumbering oil tankers that provide a good chunk of the energy to the global market, by some estimates upwards of 20%. The question is, would they want to? And that goes into who gets that oil. And because it's primarily not the United States and not Israel that relies on the Strait of Hormuz for their oil, it's countries like China, India as well. And so that has a political motivation for Iran not to close it.
Right, and now there's a statement that you talked about, and I really want you to expand on it. You said that from a competition with Russia and China perspective, the best option for the U.S. is to let Israel continue its attacks on Iran. After all, Iran is an ally of Russia and increasingly aligned with China. So weakening Iran de facto harms the interests of the other two powers. In reference to the fact that now Iran's foreign minister is now on to, he's going to talk to Putin, could you just expand on this statement?
Sure. So what we've seen playing out really since the beginning of the Ukraine war, of Iran becoming increasingly closely tied to Russia. Iran has always depended on Russia for military equipment. The interesting thing about the Ukraine war is that Russia now became dependent on Iranian military equipment. So Russia began using Shahed drones, which are Iranian produced, in its war in Ukraine. And so those two began forming a sort of increasingly explicit alliance relationship between the two. And consequently, so if you're worried about security in Europe, going after Iran, or at least letting the Israelis go after Iran, which the Israelis want to do for their own reasons, actually does have sort of second-order positive effects for particularly the Russia angle. The China angle is also a little bit more complicated because there's a energy for support angle that the Iranians and the Chinese have had. That relationship is going increasingly intertwined. And so, there's positive effects for the global competition between the democracies of the world and the authoritarian powers, to the extent this conflict continues.
Right, and on that point, Iran's foreign minister has said that diplomacy is not the way forward after the U.S. strikes. And he's already said that Europe might, and Trump had earlier said that Europe might not be able to have a chance without military option. How do you think diplomacy plays a part here?
Well, I think there's diplomacy in many different forms. I mean, violence is its own form of diplomacy. It's a form of negotiation, of people saying, well, how much do I care about the individual states? It's a bloody form of diplomacy. This is the famed concept of the political scientist and actually former RAND member Thomas Schelling made this statement in his famous work of Arms and Influence. So there's always going to be some measure of diplomacy here. Now, whether or not we move into overt diplomacy, that I think is the different one, the negotiation between diplomats to figure out an end to the war. There's two ways to read the Iranian foreign minister statements. Either that they genuinely don't believe that there's a diplomatic option right now, or that this is a faith-saving measure by the Iranians, and while they have to respond in some form for their own domestic political reasons, they're actually more open to diplomacy, at least through back channels, and that we don't know at this point.
And now that we know that Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi will be in Moscow and to meet Putin, what do you think can be possibly the outcome of this meeting?
That's really an interesting thing to say, because President Trump has had a more friendly relationship with President Putin than certainly the Biden administration did. And so, my guess is the discussion between the Iranians and the Russians will look a little bit different today than they would have had it been under the previous administration. The Russians, on the one hand, sort of caught in this sort of catch-22. They want to back their ally, the Iranians. On the other hand, they don't really want to jeopardize their relationship with President Trump, I would assume. Mostly because that antagonizing President Trump would probably make him double down on places like Ukraine, which the Russians really don't want them to do. So it's a little bit of an interesting diplomatic dance from the Russian perspective.
Interesting. Now, a New York Times report quoting a U.S. official says the American military and intelligence officials have detected signs of possible retaliation. At this point, as you mentioned, Israel has been attacking Iran, eliminating its military heads, probably going after the air defense systems of Iran. Do you think Iran at this point is capable of attacking U.S. bases?
Yes. And they have two real trump cards here. First off, they still have a substantial missile supply, particularly of shorter range ballistic missiles, which may not be able to reach Israel, but they certainly can reach our bases in Iraq or in the Gulf states or potentially in Syria as well. Second, while Iran's proxy network has been battered, particularly Hezbollah, as well as Hamas, they still have proxies, particularly in Iraq, and to a lesser extent in Syria, which can go after and target American bases. These are small bases with only a handful of troops on it, and therefore they're at greater risk of insurgent attacks. In fact, they have been attacked by insurgents even before this conflict started. The idea that Iran would try to ramp that up, I think, is well within keeping with Iran's sort of general modus operandi.
Right, and apart from U.S. bases or the Strait of Hormuz, what other ways do you think Iran can retaliate at this point?
So Iran has a couple different options here. They still have more missiles, so they can launch a sort of larger scale barrage, either targeting both Israeli infrastructure but also American infrastructure. You could imagine them targeting American bases, American embassies in the region and the like. Iran has been known to deal with covert action and terrorism too. Iran, for instance, was behind the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut famously, and also the bombing of Khobar Towers. We had airmen in Saudi Arabia in the 1990s. So they have a long history of doing this. You can imagine them doing that again. The Iranians are very active in the cyber realm. So you can imagine them trying to utilize that dimension as well. So Iran, though battered over the last week and a half of conventional military fighting, they still have cards to play, and I would expect to see at least some activity with those cards here in the next couple days.
Right. I think I'm going back to the question, but like European parties like UK, France, and Germany have been trying their best to develop a kind of a diplomatic deal at this point in time with, you know, and it's interesting because there was a meeting between the Iran FM and the diplomats on Friday, and just a couple of hours after you saw the U.S. strikes. How do you analyze the West's role after U.S. strikes, especially when Trump had earlier said that Europe might not have a chance without military option?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a positive, optimistic scenario where the increased military pressure leads to a better Iran nuclear deal. Remember, we go back to the original nuclear deal that the Obama administration cut. It had several limitations. It had sunset measures, which means that the agreement was going to expire after 10 years. It didn't do much for the missile program. It didn't do anything to curb Iran's use of proxies. You could imagine that the increased military pressure, thanks to Israeli military action, but to a certain extent American military action, would force the Iranians to cut a better deal with the West. That's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that the military action basically forecloses any sort of diplomatic negotiation whatsoever, in which case it's ultimately on the military tool of power to bring this conflict to a close.
Right, and that's very interesting because you put the pessimistic, because at this point it's hard to believe that Iran would want to come to the table, because we have Iran's of FM saying that, well, diplomacy is not the way forward after these strikes. You know, it's hard to believe that it would actually lead them to a table and not make them actually want to go back to building their nuclear facilities after these attacks.
Well, it depends. I mean, if the Iranian regime believes that its stability is threatened, that very well may change its cost calculus. And I think in some ways, you know, you referenced President Trump's statements earlier. I think that's partly the message that the United States, to a lesser extent, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been stating as well, which is if you want to continue this military action, it's going to threaten your regime's survival, then that may change Iran's cost calculus, because as much as they want to have a nuclear weapon at the end of the day, they also want to make sure that the regime survives. And so that I think is what the strategy is here.
Yeah, and there's this one, because I just got to that question. Now, you talked about the regime change. I'm just a little curious about the fact that would Iran, like for now, the top leaders, of course, is Khamenei. But when we talk about regime change, the Iran political scenario is kind of like complicated, but do you think the other government members in Iran, or they would actually want to agree to go for a deal and not go back to building its nuclear facilities? How would that operate if if Khamenei probably gets eliminated?
Yeah, so I mean, Iran is a fascinating country in the sense that it is undergoing major demographic shifts. So it has a younger population, which is more westernized, more secular, and not necessarily in line with the older hardliners. It's important to remember that Khamenei, aside from being the supreme leader and a cleric, he's also 86. So, he represents a different generation. And you've seen in previous attempts, large-scale protests in Iran over things like wearing of the hijab, monkeying around in the elections as well. So there's very clear signs that the Iranian people are not necessarily lockstep with the regime. Now, that's the optimistic scenario. We need to say that the pessimistic scenario as well is that, traditionally speaking, whenever a country's engaged in military action, there tends to be a little bit of a rally around the flag effect. So people who aren't necessarily fans of the regime go and support the regime because they're being attacked by an outside entity. So it's sort of interesting to see how that cuts here in Iran. And the problem with authoritarian countries or closed societies, you can't get good polling data, so you really don't necessarily know where popular sentiments lie in great fidelity.
All right, of course. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but it was, thank you so much for joining, Mr. Cohen, giving your insights. I appreciate that.